Let her play at merchant. By autumn,
She owned every road his army depended on.
Sir, she renegotiated every southern route.
she did this?
Your army nearly starved, while men wearing your uniform became rich.
The war was never won by my sword. It was won by the woman I once dismissed.
Let her play at merchant?
The Duke said, and rode off to war. By autumn, she owned every road his supplies moved on. The 4th of April was not meant to be a turning point at the Alderbrook supply yards, which was exactly why no one saw it coming. The morning fog off the harbour had not yet lifted, and the cobblestones near the eastern gate still glistened from a night of restless rain. But by 8, the merchants had begun to line up outside the ledger house, and by 11, foreign traders who had once refused to speak with anyone below the rank of Duke were waiting, patiently, for a woman in emerald green to receive them first.
That woman was Oriana.
She stood over the great tactical map, with one gloved hand braced against the table, the other curled around a rolled parchment she had not yet chosen to open. Her dark hair was pinned high, loose strands catching the gold light spilling from the palace colonnade behind her, and her eyes moved across the map the way a general reads a battlefield, not a merchant reading a ledger. Around her, the yard churned with movement horses stamping, chests stacked 3 high, soldiers marching past in tight formation, and through all of it, she did not flinch. Across the square, Duke Nathaniel Crown watched her from beneath the shadow of his crimson cape, his jaw set, his gaze sharp with a doubt he had not yet learned to question. He had given the order. He had said the words. And in 3 days, he would ride for the border with a treasury so empty his own commanders had stopped meeting his eyes.
He believed he was leaving chaos behind him to be managed.
He had no idea he was leaving his entire war in her hands.
The gates of the Imperial supply yard groaned open before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, and Oriana stepped through them into a world of controlled disaster.
Crates towered in crooked stacks. Clerks shouted over each other. Somewhere behind a wall of barrels, a horse screamed in protest as a rope snapped taut. She did not flinch. She simply tightened her grip on the ledger book tucked beneath her arm and walked forward, boots striking the cobblestones with a rhythm that did not match the chaos around her. It was steadier, slower, deliberate. No one greeted her. No one was meant to. The clerk, who finally noticed her presence, looked at her the way one might look at a lost bird that had wandered into a slaughterhouse with mild pity and no expectation that she would last the week. She was shown to a desk buried under 3 months of unfiled reports, the ink faded, the numbers wrong in places no one had bothered to correct. It was, she understood immediately, meant to be a burial, not a job.
She opened the first ledger anyway.
By mid-morning, word had already reached the front gate that Duke Nathaniel Crown was preparing to ride. His commanders stood at attention as stable hands led out the war horses, and behind them, a line of supply wagons sat half-loaded, their contents far too sparse for a campaign that was meant to hold an entire border through winter. "The treasury will not survive the season," one commander said quietly, careful not to let his voice carry too far. Nathaniel did not answer. He was watching the yard behind him, where a woman in deep emerald green had just been handed a stack of forgotten paperwork by a clerk, clearly relieved to be rid of it. He had agreed to let her manage the ledgers only because his mother had asked, and because he did not expect it to matter.
He mounted his horse without another glance in her direction.
By the time Oriana had cleared her desk enough to see its surface, a runner burst into the office, breathless, his uniform dusted with road grit. The eastern gate had jammed. Not from disrepair, from deliberate obstruction. A convoy of grain wagons meant for the front lines sat locked behind a barricade of crates no one could explain, and the guards posted there claimed no knowledge of who had ordered it.
She was on her feet before he finished speaking.
The eastern gate, when she reached it, was a wall of shouting men and immovable cargo. Soldiers argued with merchants. Merchants argued with each other. And beneath it all, the wagons carrying desperately needed grain sat exactly where they had been left, going nowhere. Oriana climbed onto the nearest crate without waiting for permission, her rolled parchment tucked beneath one arm, and studied the blockage the way she might study a battlefield. Then she began giving orders calm, precise, utterly without hesitation. The men blinked at her. And then, slowly, they obeyed. Nathaniel rode out of the capital that afternoon, with his commanders flanking him and his crimson cape snapping behind him in the wind. Utterly unaware that the gate crisis threatening his army's first shipment had already been resolved by a woman he had dismissed with barely a second glance. He would not learn of it for weeks. The war maps were still spread across the long table in the command hall when Nathaniel returned to inspect them one final time before departure. And it was there bent over the same table, tracing a supply route with one gloved finger that he found her. "You've taken to the maps quickly," he said, his tone edged with something between curiosity and warning. "They're not so different from ledgers," Oriana replied without looking up. "Both show you exactly where things fall apart." He studied her for a long moment, arms folded, his sharp gaze weighing her the way he weighed any unfamiliar variable in a campaign with suspicion first and patience second, if at all. "This is not a merchant's game, Miss Oriana. Men's lives depend on what happens in these yards." "Then it's fortunate," she said, finally meeting his eyes, "that I intend to take it seriously." He said nothing to that. He only turned, cape sweeping behind him, and walked toward the courtyard where his horse waited. She watched him go and told herself his doubt did not sting. It stung anyway. The visiting trade delegates arrived 2 days later, and with them came Supply Officer Renwick, a broad, self-satisfied man who had run the yard's contracts for the better part of a decade and had no intention of surrendering that control to an unfamiliar young woman with a borrowed title. He made his move in front of the delegates themselves, his voice pitched to carry. "She has no authority here," he announced, gesturing dismissively toward Oriana, as though she were a misplaced decoration in the hall. "Whatever the Duke has permitted, this office does not answer to her." The delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Trade, after all, thrived on confidence, and confidence was exactly what Renwick was trying to strip from her in front of the men she needed most.
Oriana did not raise her voice.
She simply opened the ledger she had been carrying, laid it flat on the table between them, and pointed to a column of numbers that did not add up, numbers that led directly back to contracts Renwick himself had signed. The room went very quiet. "Perhaps," she said evenly, "we should discuss authority after we discuss arithmetic." Renwick's composure cracked at the edges just slightly. The delegates, sensing which way the wind had shifted, began speaking to Oriana directly. By the end of the hour, 3 new contracts bore her signature instead of his. She had made her first enemy of the yards, and her first allies among the foreign merchants who mattered. That night, alone in the office long after the clerks had gone home, Oriana lit a single lamp and began the audit in earnest. The ledgers stretched back years, thick with the ordinary dust of bureaucratic neglect, but as she moved further into the records, a pattern began to surface that was anything but ordinary. Grain shipments listed as received, but never distributed. Payments logged to merchants who did not exist. Contracts renewed at prices no honest trade would bear. Her pen moved faster now, cross-referencing, circling, building a picture no one in the high command had apparently wanted built. It was not simply mismanagement. It was theft deliberate, layered and dressed up in enough paperwork to survive years of casual inspection. She sat back slowly, the lamp flickering against the walls of the empty office, and understood, with a cold certainty, that she had just uncovered something someone had worked very hard to bury. The scope of it kept her awake long after the candle burned low.
The following morning, she found the note waiting on her desk before she had even removed her gloves.
Unsigned. Unmarked. 3 lines, written in a hand disguised just enough to be untraceable, a warning that the audit should stop, that some ledgers were better left closed, and that persistence would not be rewarded kindly. She read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it carefully inside the very ledger it had tried to silence, and continued exactly where she had left off.
If anything, her hand was steadier now.
Word of the threat reached no one but her. She made certain of that, but its presence changed the air of the office all the same. She began locking her findings in a second, hidden set of copies each night, working later, trusting fewer of the clerks who passed through her door. The embezzlement, she now understood, did not belong to one greedy officer. It belonged to a network. And networks, she knew, did not warn you unless you had already gotten close enough to hurt them.
She intended to get closer still.
A second note arrived 4 days later, slipped beneath her door sometime in the night, its tone sharper this time, less warning, more threat. She did not flinch while reading it. She simply added it to the growing file she was building, a file that would, in time, prove far more dangerous to its authors than to her. But the message was clear enough. Someone in the high command knew exactly how close she had come, and they were no longer willing to wait patiently for her to lose interest. She requested an armed escort for her next journey out of the capital. Not out of fear. Out of certainty that the threats were not idle. The southern markets sprawled along the river in a chaos of colour and shouted bargaining, and Oriana arrived among them not as a curious visitor, but as a woman who had already studied every trade route, every cartel alliance, and every desperate merchant looking for a way out from under crushing local monopolies. The cartels had strangled honest trade here for years, threatening any foreign merchant who dared deal with the capital directly instead of paying their inflated tolls. Oriana walked into the merchant quarter with her ledgers, her contracts, and an offer no one had thought to make before fair terms, direct payment, and protection from the very cartels currently bleeding them dry. The first merchant hesitated only a moment before extending his hand.
By sundown, 5 more had followed.
The cartel enforcers came for her the following evening, 3 men positioning themselves outside the inn where she had taken a room, their intentions clear in the way they lingered without pretense of business. Oriana had expected this. She had, in fact, planned for it. Her escort emerged from the shadows before the men could so much as approach the door, and what might have become a confrontation dissolved instead into a tense, wordless standoff that ended with the enforcers retreating into the dark, their authority quietly, publicly broken. The merchants who witnessed it understood the message immediately. The old fear no longer held power here. By the time Oriana left the southern markets a week later, she carried signed contracts from every major trade house in the region, contracts that bypassed the corrupt middlemen entirely and funneled goods directly toward the capital's starving treasury. It was, quietly, the beginning of an empire that answered to her alone. At the front, the change arrived not as news, but as cargo wagons rolling into camp 3 full weeks ahead of schedule, their supplies fresh, their manifests signed by merchant houses Nathaniel had never once done business with directly. His quartermaster delivered the report with visible confusion. These contracts, they're new. Someone renegotiated the southern routes. Nathaniel took the manifest himself, scanning the unfamiliar signatures, the surprisingly favourable terms, the sheer volume of goods arriving at a fraction of the cost his own officers had budgeted for. He recognised none of the merchant names.
He recognised only one signature at the bottom of the final page.
He said nothing to his commanders that night. But long after the camp had gone quiet, he sat alone by the firelight, turning the manifest over in his hands, and allowed himself, for the first time, to wonder exactly who he had left behind in those chaotic supply yards. The doubt did not leave him easily. It only deepened 3 days later, when a second shipment arrived larger, faster, impossibly well organised, accompanied by a brief note from the capital confirming that the eastern trade routes had been fully secured against further cartel interference. His commanders began speaking her name with something close to reverence. Nathaniel found, to his own quiet unease, that he could no longer dismiss it as easily as he once had. By the 4th week, provisions were arriving so far ahead of need that his officers had begun requesting additional storage simply to hold the surplus. Morale, which had been fraying at the edges since the campaign began, steadied almost overnight. Men who had once whispered about a starving winter now spoke of holding the border through spring if necessary. Nathaniel stood at the edge of camp one evening, watching the newest wagons roll in beneath a darkening sky, and felt something shift inside him that he was not yet ready to name. He had left the capital, certain he was riding toward inevitable ruin. Instead, somewhere behind him, a woman he had barely acknowledged was quietly building the very foundation his entire war now stood upon, and for the first time since riding out those gates, Nathaniel found himself wondering not whether his campaign would survive the season, but whether he had been wrong about her from the very beginning. The drawing rooms of the capital had never cared much for supply yards or grain contracts, but by the 6th week of Oriana's rise, they had found a new favourite subject at every tea and card table in the city. Whispers curled through silk fans and behind raised wine glasses that the Duke's merchant girl had grown far too bold, that no woman managed foreign trade houses without favours exchanged, that her sudden influence over the capital's coffers was unnatural, unseemly, dangerous.
None of it was true. All of it spread anyway.
Oriana heard the rumours second-hand, delivered by a clerk who looked faintly embarrassed to repeat them. She did not dignify them with anger. She simply opened her ledgers again and let the numbers keep speaking louder than the gossip ever could. The whispers reached further than she expected, though curling into the ears of officers who resented her success, and merchants' wives who envied a woman managing more capital than their husbands ever had. By week's end, an anonymous letter had reached the palace itself, questioning whether a duke's household ought to entrust its treasury to an unmarried woman with no noble blood. Oriana read the letter once, standing very still in the morning light. Then she folded it precisely in half and returned to her work without a word. She had survived threats before. Gossip, she decided, would not be what broke her stride now. Nathaniel arrived back in the capital without warning on a grey afternoon, thick with the smell of coming rain, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his commanders trailing behind him in stunned silence. He had told no one he was coming. He wanted, he told himself, to see the yards exactly as they truly were, not as reports and glowing manifests had described them.
What he found stopped him at the gate.
The chaos he remembered, the shouting, the crooked stacks, the broken wagons, was gone. In its place stood ordered rows of crates, clerks moving with purpose, wagons rolling in and out on a schedule so precise it might have been drawn by a military strategist rather than a merchant. He stood there for a long moment, cape damp with rain, and said nothing at all. He found her in the logistics pavilion an hour later, bent over a spread of contracts with 3 foreign merchants seated attentively across from her, hanging on every word she said. She did not rise when he entered. She simply glanced up, acknowledged him with the barest nod, and continued negotiating terms that he could see even from the doorway heavily favoured the crown. The merchants left with satisfied smiles and signed agreements. Nathaniel remained standing in the doorway long after they had gone, watching her gather the papers with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything, and felt, for the first time, the uncomfortable weight of being the one out of place in his own supply yard. "You've made changes," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I've made progress," she corrected, not looking up. "There's a difference." The words landed harder than she intended, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes, not quite anger, not quite admiration. Something caught between the two, unresolved and simmering. He said nothing further that evening. But he did not leave the yard either. He stayed, watching from the shadows of the pavilion, studying every transaction, every ledger entry, every contract bearing her signature instead of his own command's seal. By the time the candles burned low, his silence had turned into something far more dangerous than simple curiosity. It had turned into resolve.
The confrontation came 2 days later, inside the same pavilion where she had built her quiet empire, and it arrived without warning.
Nathaniel entered, flanked by 2 of his senior officers, a stack of her contracts in his hand. His jaw set in the particular rigidity of a man who had convinced himself, overnight, that he was reclaiming lost ground rather than surrendering to fear. "These agreements were made without proper military oversight," he said, his voice carrying across the pavilion. "I'm authorizing a full review effective immediately. Until then, no further contracts will bear your signature alone." The room went still. Clerks froze mid-motion. Even the merchants lingering near the doorway fell silent, sensing the shift in the air. Oriana set down her pen slowly. "You'd override agreements that have kept this army fed for 2 months?" "I'd override agreements I don't understand," he shot back, "made by someone with no accountability to the crown." "No accountability?" Her voice remained level, but something sharpened beneath it now, a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Then perhaps you should ask your own high command where the crown's funds actually went before I arrived." His officers shifted uneasily. Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Careful." "I am being careful," she said, stepping toward the table where her ledgers waited, already open to the pages she had marked weeks ago. "Careful enough to have proof."
She turned the book toward him.
Column after column, name after name officers within his own command. Contracts inflated far beyond honest value, payments funneled to merchants who existed only on paper. The very corruption that had bled the treasury dry long before she ever arrived. Nathaniel stared at the numbers. His officers stared at the floor.
"This is," he started and stopped, his voice suddenly unsteady.
"This is why your army nearly starved," Oriana said quietly, "while men who wore your uniform grew wealthy behind your back." The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before it, heavier, colder, filled with the particular horror of a man realizing the enemy had been standing beside him in polished boots the entire time. Nathaniel's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "Which officers?" he said finally, voice low and dangerous.
Oriana turned another page and began, name by name, to answer him.
By the time she finished, 2 of the 3 officers he had brought with him would not meet his eyes at all. The 3rd had already begun edging toward the door, a decision Nathaniel noted with a stillness far more frightening than shouting would have been. "You knew," he said to Oriana, though his gaze remained fixed on the officers before him. "You've known for weeks." "I've been building proof for weeks," she corrected. "There's a difference between suspicion and certainty. I intended to bring you certainty." Something in his chest twisted, not quite shame, not quite gratitude, but close enough to both that he found himself momentarily unable to speak. He had ridden in preparation to strip her of authority. He was leaving, having discovered exactly how much of his command's survival depended on the very authority he'd tried to take. The arrests came swiftly after that, carried out quietly to avoid panic among the ranks, but thoroughly enough that every officer who had profited from the theft understood the reckoning had finally arrived. Nathaniel oversaw it himself, his fury banked into something colder and far more effective than the outburst that had brought him into the pavilion. When it was finished, he returned to find Oriana still at her desk, exactly where he had left her hours earlier.
"I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth.
"You owe the crown a stable treasury," she replied, though the edge in her voice had softened considerably. "The apology is optional."
He almost smiled. Almost.
It was, she would later admit, the first moment she saw the rigid duke beneath the uniform begin just slightly to bend. With the corruption exposed and the trade routes fully secured, the treasury filled faster than even Oriana had projected. Merchant houses that had once hesitated now competed for the honour of supplying the crown, and gold flowed toward the front lines in quantities that transformed the entire character of the war. Nathaniel's counter-offensive launched within the month, and where his army had once faced a slow, grinding stalemate born of desperation, it now moved with the confidence of men who knew, for the first time in years, that they would not run out of provisions before they ran out of enemies. The border towns fell one after another beneath a campaign fueled not by desperation but by abundance. Word of the victories reached the capital in a steady stream of triumphant dispatches, and with each one, Oriana felt a quiet, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the man leading those men into battle. She had not simply funded a war.
She had made victory possible.
The autumn campaign became, within weeks, the stuff of tavern songs and court gossip alike, a reversal so complete that even the whispering, nobles who had once mocked Oriana's presence in the yards now spoke her name with careful respect, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of history twice. Nathaniel returned from the front briefly during the height of the offensive, not for rest, but to personally oversee the surge of new contracts flooding in from merchants eager to attach themselves to the crown's sudden prosperity. He found Oriana in the same pavilion as always, though the chaos around her now hummed with the energy of unmistakable success rather than desperate improvisation.
He watched her for a long moment before she noticed him.
"You could have told me," he said quietly, once she finally looked up, "how deep this ran. From the beginning. You wouldn't have believed me," she said. Not then. He couldn't argue with that. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. That evening, long after the yards had quieted and the last merchant caravan had rolled through the gates, Nathaniel found her alone beneath the covered walkway overlooking the supply square, the autumn air sharp, with the first true chill of the season. "I misjudged you," he said without preamble. "Not once. Repeatedly. You judged what you expected to see," Oriana replied, not unkindly. "Most people do. That's generous of you. It's honest." She turned to face him fully now, her composure as steady as it had been on the very first day he'd dismissed her with barely a glance. "You expected a merchant playing at authority. What you got was someone who refused to fail simply because you assumed she would." He studied her, in the fading light the same sharp determination he had once mistaken for irrelevance, the same unshakable resolve he had once written off as naivety. He understood now, standing here, that he had spent months underestimating the one person whose brilliance had kept his entire campaign from collapsing. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who admits he was wrong," he said finally, the words rough with something unfamiliar to him vulnerability. "I've never had a reason to practice it."
"Then, this can be your first lesson," she said, the barest hint of warmth breaking through her composure.
He laughed a short, startled sound, as though he'd forgotten he was capable of it. "You're not going to make this easy for me, are you?" "No," she said. "But I suspect you've had enough people make things easy for you." Look where that led. He fell silent at that, and this time the silence between them held none of the tension from the pavilion, only the quiet, charged stillness of two people finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. "I need you," he admitted finally, the words costing him more effort than any battlefield command ever had. "Not merely for the treasury. Not merely for the contracts. I need your mind beside mine. Your judgment where my pride has failed me." Oriana's breath caught, just slightly, though her expression remained composed. That's a significant admission for a man who once told his commanders to let me play at merchant. "I was a fool," he said simply. "I intend to spend considerable effort correcting that." She allowed herself, finally, a small smile. "Then let's begin with the map table. There's a border settlement that will need proper administration once the campaign concludes, and I have opinions about how it should be managed."
"Of course you do," he said, and this time his voice carried something unmistakably close to affection.
The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, held in the same grand hall where Nathaniel had once dismissed her with a careless remark before marching off to a war he'd nearly lost. Now the hall was filled with merchants, foreign dignitaries, and nobles who had spent the season learning better than to underestimate the woman standing beside the Duke at the head of the great map table. Nathaniel stood in his formal uniform, crimson cape draped over one shoulder, and took Oriana's gloved hand in his before the assembled court.
"This campaign,"
he announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, was won not on the battlefield alone, but in these very yards by a mind sharper than any general's, and a resolve I foolishly underestimated. I stand here today, not merely as a duke returning victorious, but as a man acknowledging his equal in every sense that matters. The room erupted not in scandal, as the gossiping nobles might once have predicted, but in genuine, thunderous approval. The merchant houses that had pledged their loyalty to Oriana months before nodded with quiet satisfaction, watching the crown finally catch up to what they had recognized all along. Oriana met Nathaniel's eyes across the map table, the same table where she had once stood alone against his skepticism, and felt the full weight of how far they had both travelled since that first cold assessment in the war room. "Partnership," she said softly, for his ears alone, "was never something I needed you to grant me."
"No," he agreed, his hand tightening around hers, "but I needed the chance to earn it anyway."
Outside the hall, the autumn light spilled gold across the same supply square where it had all begun, the chests, the maps, the waiting cavalry, except now the chaos had become order, the doubt had become devotion, and the woman once dismissed as playing at merchant stood as the architect of an empire that answered, at last, to no one's authority but her own, and the man who had finally earned the right to stand beside her. Somewhere in that golden light, a rolled parchment lay forgotten on the map table, its edges worn from months of careful planning, no longer needed to prove what everyone in that hall now understood without question. She had never simply played at merchant. She had built an empire no crown could have built without her.
And as the bells across the capital rang out in celebration of a war won by ledgers as much as by swords, one question lingers long after the story ends.
If you were in Nathaniel's boots, watching everything you built collapse until a stranger saved it, without asking for credit, would pride let you admit she'd earned her place beside you? Or would you have marched off just the same, never once looking back to see who was quietly winning your war for you? Tell us what you would have done. And stay close, because the next story waiting at these gates is already unfolding.